Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to CoachX Live with the Institute of Coaching. My name is Jeffrey Hull. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Coaching, and I am super excited to have two for one today. We have two of our favorite thought leaders with the Institute of Coaching joining us today, authors of this new, really interesting and exciting book called The End of Leadership as We Know It. Quite provocative, what it takes to lead in today's volatile and complex world. Steve Garcia and Dan Fisher are in the house. So I want to welcome everyone to the CoachX Live, and hopefully the comment section will work. So I want to welcome you from around the world. I know we always get folks from almost everywhere around the planet, so please take a minute and say hello from wherever you are. And as always, feel free to put your comments in the comment section, and we will try to get to some of the questions as we go along. So as I said, Dan and Steve are good friends of the Institute of Coaching. They're very well-known thought leaders. They have a super new, wonderful new book out. I'm particularly honored to be able to say that I'm on the faculty of one of their leadership initiatives. So we are constantly looking for opportunities to work together. But if you haven't had a chance to meet or know Dan and Steve, let me give you just a quick summary of their very impressive backgrounds. Steve Garcia is the co-founder, they're both co-founders really, and managing partners of Contemporary Leadership Advisors, and also board members and co-founders of what they call the Institute for Contemporary Leadership, which convenes executives through a number of different programs to explore the future of leadership. Steve and Dan were both with AlixPartners Leadership and Organizational Effectiveness practice prior to founding CLA. But Steve's interesting because he's really a techie who worked for the US Congress Office of Technology Assessment. So he's got a strong technology background. Dan, on the other hand, who is also managing partner at Contemporary Leadership Advisors, also managed the organizational effectiveness practice at AlixPartners, but he is a clinically trained trauma and forensic psychologist. So we have a psychologist and a technologist in the house. So we've got it all covered. Anyway, they have a great new book out, and I want to jump in very quickly to get them to share a little bit about how this book came about, what their hopes are for the book, and then we'll dive into some of the content. So Dan, Steve, welcome. I don't know who wants to get started, but we'd love to hear a little background of how this book came to be written by the two of you.
Absolutely. And people will quickly realize that Steve is the more quiet, pensive, thoughtful, smarter one. And I'm the guy who really loves to talk. So
Dan's the good-looking one.
Yeah, and the more handsome one. So, thankfully we're on Zoom, not on a podcast. So let me also just, first of all, Jeff, thank you for having us on here. And it really is a pleasure for Steve and I to not only be here with you, but also with IOC, which I've been a member of for a long time and have the utmost respect. And just to go back a little bit about how Steve and I got here in the first place, there's a little bit of an IOC family connection in that when we were at AlixPartners, we got the itch to do some more innovative, edgy things with leaders. We were doing some amazing work within this global management consulting firm. And we then started thinking, gee, how do we really impact these leaders that are operating in so much complexity and volatility that some of the things that we've traditionally done as coaches and that they've done as leaders no longer map. And part of our influence on this really came from our relationship with David Peterson, the late David Peterson.
Very special to us.
Yeah.
Yes.
Who was at the time leading leadership and coaching at Google and really had a front row seat into what was going on in the world through this radical change in technology and scaling and complexity and interconnectedness. So when we were talking to David about it, we had the idea of, hey, let's go do a think tank innovation lab on what's really required for contemporary leadership. And that's how we created the Institute for Contemporary Leadership. And then Steve, myself, and our colleague Beth Gillette, who probably folks in IOC know as well, spun off as well a consulting practice out of the Institute that uses a lot of the thought leadership that we've been developing there to bring to our clients. And we're very clever fellows and fellas, and we will pick the minds of all of these brilliant thought leaders on leadership and development and the practitioners. And then we sort of go, that's a great idea. Let's use that. So part of the book comes from our ability to pull out really amazing ideas from folks. The specific origin for the book actually came from a good friend of mine who's also a client, had seen some really amazing things at her company through COVID and the George Floyd scenario, and felt like some of these stories should be told. And so she came to me and said, hey, you guys are doing such interesting things around contemporary leadership. Maybe we could work on a book on this. So that book is eventually going to get written. But in the process of us talking to some of the experts in business books, their advice to us was, by the time this book comes out, people are going to have a little bit of COVID fatigue. So I don't know if this book is really the book you want to write. But what excited this guy was when I talked about a lot of things that Steve is really passionate about, and that he's devoted a lot of his time to thinking about and speaking about and writing about in various capacities in terms of networks, network analysis. How do you impact systems? And thinking about complex adaptive systems as a frame and mental model for leaders to think about what they're doing. And as we talk about for coaches, this is really one of the things that they can do. He goes, that's really exciting. He goes, I think that would be something that would be additive to the canon of leadership development and what leaders need to be doing now. So I went back to Steve and said, I know you're busy, but what do you think about authoring this book on this? And Steve, who has exceptional capacity to take on new things, said, yep, let's do it. And we got ourselves some support, some writing support. And over the last, 18 to 24 months, that's what we've been working on. And that's how the book came about.
Very exciting. Steve, you want to add anything to your vantage point about how it all fell into place?
I think the key thing for me, Jeffrey, was, Dan and I work with lots of different leaders from, small startups to big Fortune 500 companies, private equity backed portfolio companies. And one of the things they all have in common is that as the world has gotten sort of more tumultuous and disruptive, they're really struggling. They're struggling to have make the impact that they want to make. And see their organizations thrive. And so what was important to me was really describe, why existing approaches aren't working as well as they used to, and highlight what leaders, in a really practical way could do differently to be more successful in, the VUCA world that we're all struggling with.
Right. Yeah, no, I can totally appreciate that. And I love the mention, Dan, about systems network analysis. You guys are probably familiar with a research project that the Institute supported through one of our grants that was ultimately published, called the Ripple Effect of Coaching, which was, where, I'm forgetting his name, it goes right out of my head, but where one of the studies was looking at the impact of coaching, not just on the individual, but on the organization, like 2-3 levels away from the individual, and found that when there was positive impact on the change of behavior in the leader, that actually had a really big impact on the organization, the team, and all the different connective tissues of the organization. And so I think it's really interesting that you're actually aware of that kind of phenomenon and probably have included that in the way that you're asking leaders to behave differently in response to these different challenges, right?
It's a really good point, Jeffrey. And I was really, surprised when I saw the impact that it has, not just on the leader, but it actually goes several degrees beyond the leader, her or himself, right? And it's a really cool phenomenon, right? It just goes to show the impact we can all have, right? And one of the things that we talk about in the book is we sort of define leadership not as a set of competencies or capabilities, but as a relationship between people. So it's a different frame for leadership. And we really, focus on, if you think about leadership as a relationship between individuals, it has a big impact on, how you can develop them, the effect they can have in the organization, how they think about leading in general. And so we spent a lot of time sort of describing what that different perspective means for how leaders behave, show up, and set up their organizations for success.
Absolutely. And that name just popped in my head. So to give credit to Sean O'Connor, who did the research on the ripple effects of coaching. So let's jump into the some of the, because I know you have a long list that you go through in the book of particular behaviors, blind spots, issues that leaders are challenged with today and how to respond more effectively in today's world. So maybe give me, what do you consider to be some of the key areas that are focal points for both coaches and leaders to be thinking about?
Well, go ahead, Dan.
No, you start. I'll jump in and I'll correct you. So you go ahead, start.
Excellent, thank you. I appreciate being backstopped. Thank you. So I think one is what we described, which is thinking about the relationship and the importance of the relationship and how can you cultivate that. And our research shows that like senior leaders are juggling 240 some relationships, and so how do you manage that and make that work, right? In a complex system, it's really the ability to dynamically rewire the organization that really determines outcomes, right? So the ability to sort of change that is one key thing. I think another one is, stop planning, start experimenting. In a world where it's much harder to determine cause and effect or predict outcomes over time, right? I think we see a lot of folks struggling to try and find the right answer when the resources required to do that actually exceed the value once you get it. So just start trying different things. So how can you move into a mode of sort of continuously experimenting, doing things in parallel sometimes, right? I think that gets to the point that resilience is as important as efficiency. For years and years, leaders have been trained that to sort of worship at the altar of efficiency, and we're seeing that when you've got really disruptive events, efficiency can really leave you flat-footed because you just don't have the capacity or the diversity of perspective to deal with changing circumstances. So focusing on we talk about how you can really focus on resilience, how you can start experimenting. I think those are just some of the examples that we speak to in the book.
Great.
Dan, you want to add to that?
First of all, I want to say, Steve, that was spot on. It's almost as if you wrote the book. Very, very well articulated. One of the many reasons that I love working with Steve and collaborating on these things is that while his focus working with our clients tends to be sort of large scale with an organizational lens, very much looking at systems and how do we help the clients optimize those systems through structure and processes. My particular area of focus, not surprisingly, as someone who was originally clinically trained, is much more on working one-on-one with the executive. Right. And so as Steve and I were working through what is it that leaders need to do now, we both bring a lens around, if we're thinking about how do you structure this overall, it's one thing. And then on an individual basis, what are you particularly working on? And what struck me, and I think for many of the folks on the call with us right now who are working with leaders, it just becomes so much more, all the stuff that we've been working with them on over the years, it's all that and some other things, but the things that we have been working with them on become so much more critical and relevant. And when they're not really excelling in those ways, they're really going to struggle and find themselves falling into some of the traps that we call out in the book. And if I sort of just piggyback a little bit on what Steve was saying, a big part of this is helping them engage in systems thinking, seeing the bigger picture, understanding that those interconnections, understanding those networks, and then going back to the things that we've always been trying to help our leaders really excel at and refine is the importance of self-awareness becomes even more critical in operating in this VUCA environment, and then being able to really reflect in a very serious way and ground themselves in some of that reality is really critical, as well as the adaptability that we know is critical not only for the organizations but for them as well. A lot of that stems from really optimizing their emotional intelligence, building on that growth mindset and continuous learning. All of that, as long if you pepper that in with a lot of really good self-care to build up their resilience, is gonna just help them not only get through navigating a lot of turbulent waters that I think all of our people are operating in, but be able to, in many ways, Jeff, as you called out, create that ripple effect in the organization. So all of those things that we're talking about on an individual basis cascade down onto their team and then further into the organization.
No, I totally agree. I think one thing that I would love, coaches in particular, would love to hear you speak to is something you talk about in the book, which is uncovering and identifying and working with blind spots. Because you can have the best intentioned leader who is completely unaware of one or two key things that show up in the way they behave, the way they come across. And the ripple effect is deleterious. In other words, it's a negative ripple effect and they're completely unaware of it. And it's an area that coaches are particularly adept at helping to uncover, work through, create a psychological safety so that it's okay to look at yourself. And I'd love to hear you comment on some of the tools or approaches that you recommend in the book to deal with those things.
I think one of the first challenges is leaders in not in all, but in many instances have been trained to hide their blind spots, right? They've been trained to not show vulnerability. They've been trained to act, really confident. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand in a much more disruptive world is the need to continually reassess, right? So what we try and do in the book is tie all the practices we talk to sort of an understanding of, complex adaptive systems and how they operate and how they're different. And so that willingness to continually reassess is, I think, something that leaders need to sort of come to terms with, because it's been so ingrained that, you need to come across as, having all the answers. So one of the people we talk about in the book, David Chang, who we've worked with, and tells the story of, when he first moved to China and was leading sort of large manufacturing sites there. And the expectation was that he would have all the answers. But he actually was switching sort of functions, and what he found is he'd be sharing his opinion, and people would just sort of be taking it as fact. And it really scared him, because he thought, hey, listen, I don't have the answer. So he just started saying, I don't know. Right, which I think is something that coaches need to give leaders permission to do, is to say, I don't know can be a really powerful way of giving other people space to share their point of view. It can be a really powerful way to build trust, right? There's lots of benefits. So something as simple as just, using those words, I think, can have a profound effect. And actually, David's story bears that out. The transformation that he achieved there was really phenomenal. So it's one of the stories I really like telling in the book.
That's great.
Yeah. On an individual basis as a coach, I stole something from Doug Riddle another, I think IOC, a friend of IOC that
Right.
people probably know.
Absolutely.
Doug led coaching practice at CCL for many years and is a brilliant coach. And, as is my tendency to steal things from people. Doug, I remember, told me how he will, during a chemistry conversation with a potential coachee, he'll say to them, look, I'm not for everybody. I'm pretty strong medicine. And so if you're signing up to coach with me, you got to know that I'm going to tell you the truth, hold the mirror to you, and I'm going to be here for you. I'm in your corner, and I'm not going to, not share with you what the reality is. And so going into my coaching engagements with folks, they already know that that's a big part of it, and that's partly what they're signing up for, is to get some insights and perspective on where they excel, what comes easy, and then where their blind spots are and what's getting in the way of them having greater impact and connecting their intention with their impact. And I'm sure, like most of the people on this call, that'll come from me having conversations with the key people that they work with, their key stakeholders, to find that out. And in almost every case, unless there's some sort of political reason, sensitivity not to, I'll use Rob Kaiser's Leadership Versatility Index as a 360 tool to get feedback on them. And one of the reasons why I just adore that tool, find it so valuable, is that rather than asking if somebody is good at a specific critical leadership behavior that maps to either them being supportive and enabling, or forceful and directive, or strategic or operational, it asks very specifically, does the leader engage in this behavior the right amount, too much, or not enough? Since we know that versatility, knowing what to do when and how, with whom, in what ways, is really the key to being successful for them, as well as us as a coach with them. Those feedback you get from that will surface those blind spots for them really nicely. And right, we're data driven, we come with data. And so, and then my hack, everybody here has their little hack, perhaps, by how they induce their coachee to be open to that feedback, is I always tell them, not everybody I work with is really open to feedback, because they haven't had some of the maybe experiences you've had around performance and optimizing that. But I know you'll be eager to hear this. And so that usually puts a frame of mind where they're like, yeah, absolutely, lay it on.
Whether you really are or not, you will be, right?
They will be now after that. So
yeah. That's great. Yeah. We have a really interesting question that came in. So I'd like to honor that, from Joris Gajada. She's asking about the culture of scarcity that comes up for a lot of leaders today. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, actually, because it is something that shows up with a lot of leaders, that, we are in a, fight for the limited resources kind of world. And so how, as leaders, can they shift that mindset? How can coaches help with that? I think that's what she's trying to get at.
It's a great question, and there's probably lots of ways to think about it, right? There's, sort of the sense of personal scarcity. Am I willing to delegate, or am I afraid that if I delegate, I'll lose, control or insight over the process? How do I negotiate with peers for resources, in the organization, right? So I think there's lots of ways you can think about it. I think in general, I think one way to help address that issue is to think about, where do you have commonality with whoever that other is, right? So what are your shared goals? If you can think about it from the standpoint of, if you're negotiating with peers, for example, for resources, so you can, complete important projects, right? Is how can you redefine your goal collectively, right? Or if you're, debating, do I delegate or not delegate? Like, how can you think about the work more broadly, and what your common accountabilities are with others? I think that reframe can be an important way to sort of getting out of that scarcity mindset. That's the first thing that occurs to me. Dan, you probably have thoughts on that.
It's a great question, and I think that as coaches, we're probably hearing a lot more of that, especially if we're working in the technology sector, where this, in my experience, that scarcity mindset is it's driven by anxiety, it's driven by fear, and one of the things that I oftentimes try to engage the coaches that I'm working with is having, a reality-based skepticism and a reality-based optimism.
That's great.
That, whether you're going to be skeptical or optimistic about, the opportunities, the resources, just make sure you're not over-indexing and being driven too much by your emotions. So this just goes back to sort of a little bit of my clinical training. And when I was a therapist many decades ago, I used to say to my anxious and depressed patients that I'd be working with, I want you to be anxious and depressed about the real it and not the BS. So that you from a scarcity perspective, you want to be in tuned when that really is applicable. And then I always feel like you're at that point, though, you want to try to figure out how to optimize the potential, the opportunity. So getting them to shift to the scarcity mindset is not usually helpful.
Right.
You want to get them to shift out of that, but the benefit of it is it may provide you with some reality to what's actually going on. And so,
yeah, I appreciate that. I often work with my client, like you, Dan, I have a psychology background, and I often will ask my clients that come across as having a scarcity mindset, leaders who feel fearful about the resource limitations. I will often ask them, where in their lives do they feel abundance?
Yeah,
it's a great question.
And where do they feel a sense of expansion and possibility? And I think that it's often right there under the surface, because as leaders, they had to have been optimistic and expansive in order to become leaders. And they forget, blind spots in my mind are often things we just forget along the way because we are caught up in so-called success. So I love these answers. I love that question. And I'm recognizing that we only have a few more minutes. So I just want to give you both an opportunity to share what big takeaways would you like folks to have from this book in terms of how to help leaders who are struggling in today's world?
Great. Steve, you want to go first?
Sure. So I think one would be that there is a model, which I think is sort of based on the natural world around, if we look at sort of how complex adaptive systems thrive, then I think there are lessons we can apply from that to how we lead. So that's probably the main takeaway. I think that one of the things that was most disruptive for me writing the book was the chapter we write around on data, because I've always I've got as you mentioned, a technology background. I've always sort of been really analytical, pride myself on leveraging data. But one of the things we talk about is how you still need that you really need to balance data with intuition and judgment. Right. And with this huge focus right now on generative AI and all that brings, and the quest for big data, more data, I think it's helpful to sort of pause and say, what do we give up in that? And what are the risks we need to be cognizant of? And how can we continue to leverage our own intuition and our own judgment to make sure that we're making the right decisions for us and then the people we serve in organizations?
Love that. Love that. Don't give up being human.
Don't give up. Well said. Absolutely.
Dan, you get the final word.
Got it. Okay, great. So I think the thing that I hope that people take away from the book, when leaders are reading the book, I hope they take away that there's a reason you're struggling. Things are really hard. They are really challenging, and increasingly so than before. And if you do adopt some different mental models, frames, a lot of it makes more sense. And within that, there are a number of things that you can do, and they're consistent really with what we've been working with leaders on for the last few decades. It's not radically different, except that if you don't do them now, you tend to fall into some of these traps that get you in trouble. And so in Marshall Goldsmith's, famous adage, what got you here isn't going to get you there. You need to be thinking differently about that. So some mindset shifts are critical.
Well, thank you both. This is super. And I am really excited for this new book. I am proud to be part of the team with you folks. And I also just want to remind everyone, first, join the Institute of Coaching if you're not a member, and look on our website to learn more about our events, because we're going to have Dan and Steve for a deeper dive on October 4th for a webinar. So if this has piqued your interest and their book is piquing your interest, please join us on October 4th. And you will get to learn even more, because we'll dive into the specific chapters which they go into for greater leadership effectiveness in this time, a difficult time that we're all going through. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining us. And I thank both Dan and Steve for taking the time, and wish you all the best with this new book. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks everyone.